London in the 1800s was one of the most polluted, unsanitary cities on earth. It was filled to the brim with poverty, crime, and disease. And for women, it was also one of the most dangerous cities. There were not only the usual concerns about being assaulted on the street, but there were also toxic workplaces, coerced medical procedures, and a highly addictive substance that was being marketed directly towards them. That last one might sound kind of familiar today. We're all well aware of the opioid crisis that's been ravaging America for decades now. But what many people don't know is that this crisis started long before that. The opium epidemic actually began over 200 years ago. And it started right here in London. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Boring History for Sleep, the show where we tell the stories that are so boring they'll put you to sleep. It's me, and today we're looking at the opium epidemic, Victorian London women. Now before we begin, if you're new here, I just wanted to say thank you for joining us, and ask that if you do enjoy the video, please hit the like button and subscribe. In the 1800s, London was a disaster waiting to happen. As the Industrial Revolution picked up steam, more and more people were flooding into the city looking for work, but there simply wasn't enough housing to go around. So instead of building more homes, Londoners just crammed as many people as they could into whatever housing was available. This led to some absolutely dreadful living conditions. The average room in London contained anywhere between 5 and 10 people, sometimes more. Most of these people were poor and had little access to basic hygiene products. So, unsurprisingly, diseases spread like wildfire through the slums. Smallpox, cholera, and typhoid were especially common. And things weren't much better, even if you were wealthy. You see, while the rich did have cleaner homes, they still shared the same streets and public transit as everyone else, so they were exposed to the same diseases as everyone else. Also, because of the miasma theory of disease, which held that diseases were created by bad smells, the wealthy tried to cover up their own waste rather than dispose of it properly. This just added to the overall pollution of the city and made the problem worse. It was into this cesspool that women were often thrust when they came to London looking for work. In fact, due to the unsafe working conditions, women were twice as likely to die on the job as men. Now, you would think that these women would avoid taking on any additional health risks, but that just wasn't the case. You see, as bad as working conditions were, they were even worse if you got sick. For example, if a woman working in a factory came down with a fever, she would be fired immediately. If she tried to go back to work before she was completely healthy, she would be beaten by her supervisor. And if she complained about it, she would be arrested for being an idle and disorderly person. This meant that if a woman got sick, she had no choice but to try and work through it, or find another job, which was easier said than done, since most jobs only hired women if they were young, unmarried, and most importantly healthy. So if a woman fell ill, she would go to great lengths to hide it. And the best way she knew to do that was with laudanum. Laudanum was an extremely popular patent medicine, meaning that it was sold as a cure-all for everything from headaches to toothaches to, yes, even COVID. Laudanum was a tincture of opium, which is a drug derived from the opium poppy. It's strong stuff, containing up to 60% alcohol and as much morphine as 2 full doses of morphine. In other words, laudanum was basically just fancy moonshine that also happened to knock you out for a few hours, given its effects. It shouldn't be too surprising that it became very popular among factory workers, who needed something to help them cope with the miserable conditions. But it didn't just help them cope. It also made it possible for them to continue working, even when they were seriously ill. After all, why take time off work when you can just pop a bottle of laudanum, fall asleep for a few hours, and then get right back to work? That's not to say that everyone was abusing laudanum. In fact, for the first half of the century, it remained mostly confined to the working class. But then something interesting happened. See, previously, the primary users of opium in Britain were poor men. They either took it to help them cope with the pain of working long hours and dangerous conditions, or they took it to help them stay awake while working the night shift. But starting in the 1840s, a growing number of middle-class women began using it as well. Why, you ask? Well, they were exposed to the same diseases as everyone else, but they were also experiencing a lot of new social pressures. For starters, the fashion of the day was to look pale and emaciated. You see, Queen Victoria had started the trend of the inward eye, which emphasized delicate features, a small waist, and a youthful appearance. This beauty standard wasn't just unhealthy, it was deadly. To achieve the desired look, women would use tight dresses to warp their spines. They would bind their waists with tight corsets to make them as narrow as possible, and they would use extreme diets to keep themselves as thin as possible. All of this took a serious toll on their health, and many found themselves turning to laudanum to help them cope. But it wasn't just the beauty standards of the era. Women were also under increasing pressure to behave in a certain way. You see, during the Victorian era, women were expected to be demure, docile, and dainty. Basically, they were expected to be the perfect little angels. But that was easier said than done. Many women simply couldn't stand the pressures of trying to live up to this impossible standard, and so they too turned to laudanum to help them escape. By the 1860s, it had become so widespread that the Times ran an editorial calling for restrictions on its sale, and the government listened. Starting in 1864, laudanum was made illegal to sell without a prescription. But this didn't stop the women. They just went to the next best thing, which was a drug called chlorodyne. Chlorodyne was invented in 1853 by a Scottish chemist named John Ernest Hull. He had developed it as a painkiller, but soon realized that it had a much wider range of uses. Like laudanum, it was excellent for treating coughs, fevers, and anxiety. And it was also highly addictive. But unlike laudanum, chlorodyne was more expensive and harder to get your hands on. So what did women do? They simply made their own. At its peak, around 1 in 3 women in London were using opium regularly, either in the form of laudanum or chlorodyne. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Surely that can't be good for them. And you'd be right. These substances were extremely dangerous and caused a whole host of physical and psychological problems. For example, it was well known that regular use of opium would lead to something called opium-induced anemia, which means that your body stops producing its monthly supply of menses. It was also known to cause skin problems, respiratory issues, insomnia, constipation, and even cancer. In addition to all of that, opium was also highly addictive. But despite all of this, women continued to use it. Why? Because as bad as it was for them, it was also the best way they knew to cope with the unbearable conditions they were forced to endure every day. It was only until the early 20th century that women finally began to win the right to vote and enter professions that their male counterparts had long dominated. Only then did they finally start to have more control over their lives and be able to make real changes for themselves and their families. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The opium epidemic of Victorian London. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Boring History for Sleep. If you did, please be sure to leave us a like and subscribe. A special thanks to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. If you would like to see your name on the screen and show the world how boring history is, please consider supporting us. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.